The initial idea for this project started 2 springs ago when I built this small wildlife pond from some spare materials. This wasn't a traditional design, it was made more for photography, so it had steep raised edges to funnel the wildlife to the back of the pond, and since there was only one way in and one way out, this was an ideal setup to film animals visiting the water. Over the next few months, I watched just how many species this little pond was benefiting, and it was during this time that I decided I wanted to give them something even better. A larger pond that's more wildlife friendly, that doesn't only focus on water, but also beneficial habitat features and native wildflowers. So fast forward to this year where a few warm sunny weeks in March melted the snow and I broke ground on my new wildlife pond. I started by removing all of the grass and then dug out the different levels of the pond. At its deepest, it's about 4 feet, which will help keep the water temperature more stable throughout the year. It'll also be a great place for submerged plants to grow and for frogs, tadpoles, and aquatic insects to escape predators. Once I finished digging up the pond, I immediately started setting up the pond liner. I had never installed a liner of this size and I didn't really know what I was doing, but we got it in without any punctures or major issues, so I'm very grateful for that. The pipes running to the old pond were still frozen, so we had to fill it up 1 barrel at a time, and while it filled up, I built a small wall of rocks around the deep end so the sand doesn't wash away from the edges. And once it was filled to the top, I used the leftover sand to fill in the edges and smooth out the surface around the pond. I then dug a small hole about 3.5 feet deep to build myself an in-ground observation blind. I didn't want anything too fancy, so I used some old pallets as a structure. One side of the blind would be for sitting and one side for standing, and because of the design, I was able to make a small garden on the roof of the blind. I took some chives and stone crops from the edges of my previous pond build and planted them here as a way to remember the old pond. I used some camo netting to cover the exterior of the blind, and here's what the new pond looks like so far. You can see the old one in the back is smaller and not quite as natural. Before filling in the old pond, I transferred some cattails and bulrushes into their new home. The next big thing I needed to do was to set up all the wildlife habitat. I started with tilling the area around the pond and removing as much grass as possible. This is where I'll seed the wildflower meadow. This was hands down the worst part of the entire build. I didn't mind the physical activity, but the work was just mind-numbing and never-ending. I'm sad to say that I lost 30 hours of my life to tilling and raking, and by the end of it, it wasn't even a good job. So for my own sanity, I just told myself that everything will be okay, and I slapped a "nature will figure it out" sticker on this part of the pond. But on a brighter note, some of the first migrants were starting to show up, which gave me extra motivation to finish setting up the rest of the wildlife habitat. I added some perches, brush piles, nest boxes, and dead standing logs for birds and insects to use. I even built this small floating structure with a bunch of willow cuttings in it to help absorb nutrients and clean the water. It's not the nicest, but it's only temporary until the other plants around the pond establish. The only thing left to do now at the pond was what I was most excited about, seeding the wildflower meadow. I spread 24 species of native wildflowers in the area around the pond, including some species of sunflowers, to try to attract more seed-eating birds. But before the seeds could germinate, we got hit with a massive rain and hailstorm. I didn't know it at the time, but this storm flooded the area and a lot of the seeds I put in floated and gathered into low spots around the pond. This meant that the seeds would grow in clusters instead of evenly spaced out, but luckily, nature doesn't waste an inch, and as the warm spring weather moved in, I saw that some of the bare spots in the meadow were filling in naturally with other local plant species. It was around this time when I first noticed how the different pieces of this ecosystem were slowly starting to come together. Diving beetles, back swimmers, and pond skimmers were the first to arrive. Eastern phoebes would use the perches I set up to pick off insects. Tree swallows were checking out nest boxes, brown thrashers were taking cover in brush piles, and of course, birds were coming down for the first time to drink and bathe at the pond. At the little roof garden, the chives I transplanted were one of the first plants to flower. Early spring flowers are an incredibly important food source for insects, and there were a handful of native insect species feeding on the pollen, which ultimately attracted one of the fiercest predators at the pond, jumping spiders. Even if you don't like spiders, jumping spiders are very fun to watch, especially when they're hunting. To see just how fast they are, here's a clip of one hunting in regular speed. You can barely even see it. I couldn't even focus before it took down this fly, so in order to appreciate their speed, let's slow down the footage a little bit. Here's the same jumping spider on a different hunt. It uses its large eyes to detect any potential prey and slowly creeps up on it, waiting for that perfect moment to attack and deliver the final paralyzing bite. I find this so interesting to see in slow motion, but the jumping spiders weren't the only ones having a nice meal around the pond. The local tree swallows were also enjoying the abundance of insects, so much so that after inspecting many other